Welcome to the Trigger Morning Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversations. We exchange information. We provide resources for all the viewers and the listeners of this worldwide podcast. We are streaming live, and you can also watch these interviews on Spotify, as well as our YouTube channel, which is Penton Consulting Solutions, LLC. I'm your Firemedic CEO, LP. We got part 5 that we're getting ready to record here on this very special day to me, as well as most of the country, and if not the world. This is 9/11. So this is Monday, September 11th, 2023. This interview will be coming out this Thursday. I want to just jump right into the conversation. We have our Applied Epigeneticist, our behavioral analyst back for more, Simone Nofel. She is such an incredible person. And if you're not watching these interviews, I'm telling you, you're going to be missing a whole lot of stuff. Simone, I want to thank you for joining us again for this part 5. We're going to continue to have these conversations and do this work that we're doing, because when we're talking about ancestral and generational trauma, it spins in so many directions, and we're going to go down these rabbit holes like we're going to do today. How are you doing, first and foremost? Let me just stop, because I'm going to give a quick disclaimer. If you're triggered at any point during this podcast and you need help immediately, call 911. That'll get you police, fire, EMS. If you don't have an immediate need, there's other resources that we put in the show notes. If you are suicidal, know somebody that's suicidal, or know of a suicidal situation here in the U.S., call 988 toll-free 24/7. If you need help with drugs or alcohol-related issues, whether you're a supporter or someone who is addicted to one of these things, we have the information for Al-Anon, AA, and NA. We talk about domestic violence, human and sex trafficking, sexually based offenses, true crime, and at the end of every show, we do a missing person case. And today's missing person case is going to be very near and dear to me, because again, today is September 11th, and it is part true crime, part missing person. But that missing person case was solved. Simone Nofel, what's going on, my sister?
I'm doing so well. Today has been such a beautiful day, very relaxing and healing. So I'm excited for this conversation.
I'm just going to jump right into it. So, for those that don't know, Mrs. LP and I have these brilliant, funny, thoughtful, from A to Z conversations every day, all day, and twice on Sunday. And sometimes we have these conversations and we just don't know where they're going to go. They just sometimes, when I say out of control, I don't mean in a negative sense. I mean, they just go rabbit holes, if you want to call it that, in the twilight zone, whatever you want to call it, we go there. Just us. And it was just me, her, and the dog. I'm going to pull up on the screen. That's why I say you got to watch these interviews, because y'all miss stuff. We're talking about ancestral and generational traumas with Simone A, the Applied Epigeneticist. I had a conversation with Mrs. LP about a week and a half ago. And she showed me this article that I'm pulling up on the screen. This article comes from People magazine. If you go to people.com, and I'll post a link to this story as well as the other 2 stories that we're going to be talking about in this podcast interview today. 2 of the other stories are YouTube videos. This story is entitled "Breastfeeding Mom Ordered to Bottle Feed Child Custody Dispute." And there's a quote that says, "Why are they forcing me?" And the subtitle is, "A Virginia mom has been ordered to bottle feed her 6-month-old daughter so that the baby's father can have partial custody." And it goes into this whole story about just what I said. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to even get all into that. I'm going to give you a personal story. And part of this is a personal story for even our guest, Miss Simone. Simone's a breastfeeding mom. So who else better than have a conversation about this stuff? Mrs. LP and I were having a conversation about this article, and I said to her, my ex-wife, who's the mother of our 6 children, she breastfed all of our children when they were babies. And we went through a very nasty divorce times 2, because we got married twice and we got divorced twice. And I know part of the problem that I had in the second divorce was it changed all that. But by that time, she wasn't even nursing anymore. So we started talking about this article. We're deep diving into it. And we were talking about not just the rights of fathers, other parents that may be in a situation like this. We started talking about how in situations with not just custody, but rights as a whole, and in this country, women's rights are being attacked. We know the abortion issue is really highly contested, the Roe v. Wade, because of the new changes in the law. So we talked about that in part, and one of the things that Mrs. LP said, and we're not going to get into all of that stuff or whatever, but one of the things that Mrs. LP said was, when we think about the rights as far as reproductive rights, because this article kind of touches on that, we don't really consider how places like, and I'm just going to, for an example, a Planned Parenthood that offers reproductive services, they don't just focus on abortions. Contrary to popular belief, that's a very, very small percentage of the work that they do. A lot of it is family planning and other things, testing for STDs, and there's a bunch of different things that they do with these reproductive clinics. So we were talking about that, and we got to talking about how these clinics are typically, when you see ads and when you see people talking about it, it's always Black people that you see in these facilities getting services, and then they get vilified about that. And so that conversation went into the conversation about ancestral and generational traumas. That conversation went to a whole nother thing on these two videos that I saw on YouTube, where they're talking about the untold abuse of Black male slaves by white women. And there's a part 1 and there's a part 2, and the YouTube channel is called Black Journal. And these videos are about 20 minutes long each. And like I said, I'm not going to play them. I'll post the links to the videos as well as their story in the show notes. One of the things that really struck me, and this is where Simone comes in, and I'm just going to sit back and pass the mic over to you, is the conversations, again, in this political climate about reducing and or eliminating historical conversations, especially in academia. They're not really banning books anymore. They'll put laws on the books and say, you can't talk about a particular book. You can't talk about a particular story in a particular history book. Some states you don't have the right to talk about CRT, critical race theory. Some states are doing all kind of different things. Again, we're not going to really get into the politics of it. We're just talking about the ancestral and generational trauma and how it's affecting even today's climate, because there's so many children of all ethnicities, especially the non-melanated ones, that are being shielded from true history. The true history is being whitewashed, for lack of a better term, because a lot of times the conversation is, well, my parents didn't enslave your parents, or my grandfather didn't enslave your grandfather. And so we had this whole conversation about eugenics and epigenetics, and I thought, I need to bring Simone in on this conversation. You can start wherever you want to start. If you want to give a soliloquy, I'll just sit back and push the buttons and listen. I'm just going to sit back. And I asked Simone, I said, when we record this, I want her to read that article, I want her to watch those two videos, and I want her to write notes as she's doing all this, and don't edit shit. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you thought of me in this, because this is, again, these conversations that we're having around ancestral and generational trauma, they need to be had, because even like you and I, right? Like, we've had conversations where we might not necessarily have the same perspective, but the fact that we can come together and talk about these things, like, those are the conversations that need to be had, especially when they're doing things like banning and restricting certain literature. And, it's interesting that you brought that up here, because in one of those videos that you had me listen to and watch, they were talking about certain authors, right? And these books that came out, really depicting the true experiences of the enslaved people, which are not taught in school. And, one of these things that I know I have very different views than a lot of Black Americans is on the critical race theory, because I don't really agree with it. And I wouldn't say that in its entirety, because obviously I'm not in the public school system. I have not seen the entire curriculum. However, either way, like, you're talking about like the whitewashing of history. Like, who do we think created CRT? It's like these are things that we can start to discuss and look at, because it's really interesting to have white teachers teach Black children this anyways, like, just bottom line, no matter what it is. And then especially when you start talking about the banned and restricted books. And I know for me, like, my son, he's half Black. I do have a niece and a nephew who are fully Black. And before I was ever a mother, my oldest nephew, he was asking these certain questions, right? Because of the racial tension in our country, and he was asking certain questions because of the conversations in school. And he was the only little Black boy in his classroom at that time. And what I saw from him, this is just, one example, one experience. I'm not saying this is the same for everybody. However, what I noticed within him is that he felt disempowered. He felt less than the other students in his classroom. And that's why I don't necessarily agree with certain language that is being used within CRT, because I don't think it's an empowering way to teach history. I think it's important to understand our history and for every ethnicity to understand, but it's really about the language. And I think certain language is used intentionally. And so, yeah, my biggest thing with that is that we need to be careful of how we speak about these things. Are we saying, hey, like for the rest of your life, you're always going to have the short end of the stick? Or are we going to say, hey, like X, Y, and Z can get you to where you might be feeling like you're not the short end of the stick? And that is also, because of my conditioning and my upbringing, my dad was a Panther back in the day. And so that's my bias coming in. And so, really with this topic and kind of circling back to that first initial article that started this whole conversation, and the word that she uses, like forcing, right? Like, why are they forcing me to do this? And that again is ancestral. We can think about so many things that have rooted back even before slavery, but during that time period when Black women were forced to neglect their children so that they would breastfeed the white children. Like, all of these things are so interesting to me because it resurfaces in modern times, right? Like, history always repeats itself. It might not look the same, but it can come up in different manifestations. And I'm looking here at my notes because one thing, this is awesome, because I noticed this ever since you sent me those videos. And I've noticed it before, but I think now it's just in my face. So just yesterday, we went to a food hall. We are currently in Georgia, and we went to a food hall. Like, they have different vendors everywhere. And I was looking around. There was probably about 6 different interracial couples, Black-white couples. And out of 7 including myself and my husband, 6 of those couples, there was a white woman and a Black man. And besides me, there was only one other couple that was a Black woman and a white man. And I was sitting there thinking, because I knowing this talk is coming up, I'm like, I wonder, like, that is just so, I wonder if that example, like, right, that small sample size represents our country. And I started thinking about all of these dynamics that have come into play. And I'm like, I wonder if there is something within the Black males in our country that find white women a certain way, right, because of what they endured during slavery. And so those videos were talking about, that a lot of the erased history within the slavery time was that the women were not involved. But the real reality of it is that they were involved, and that they were actually doing a lot of horrific things, even more so than their husbands and the male counterparts. And so it was the daughters of the owners, the wives of the owners, who, because they were women, they didn't have the right to vote, they couldn't hold office. There's a lot of things that they didn't have rights on, and so then therefore they internalized that and then took it out on the Black enslaved. And so it was just really interesting as I'm sitting here in like 2023. I'm like, oh, like, I wonder why that proportion is so different. And it just got me thinking, because like on a personal level, I know I've done a lot of reflection on like, how did I end up marrying a white man, right? Like, where does that come from within me? And so it just kind of took me down this whole rabbit hole per se on how we ended up where we are today with the different tensions between races in our country. But then there's the marriages, right? Like the love. Hopefully all of these examples were of love. Like, my marriage is in love, but I'm also assuming that these marriages are great marriages, right? So that's just an assumption. It could totally not be that way. But overall, it just got me thinking about that, because when 2 different races come together and reproduce, you can kind of consider that as like the dampening of that race, right? So I've actually had Black women come up to me and saying that I'm like ruining the Black bloodline, right, by having children who are not fully Black. Even people in my own family that have kind of said things, maybe not as direct, but underlying message was there. And so it's really interesting to be in this conversation because I think that there's not that many conversations like this happening. And also like just my own thoughts, right? Of like, what happens to my bloodline when white blood comes in? And for me, this doesn't even make any sense because even without having married a white woman, like I have Irish heritage in me. I am part Cherokee and Choctaw Indian, and so there's different bloodlines already within me. So then, why would it matter if a Lebanese man came and we procreated together? You know, so there's just different things that I've been thinking about. But I'll stop there to see if you have any questions. But those are my initial train of thought.
You've heard me say this before, that we all are from the same race. And I think a lot of times people, when we're talking about race, we tend to separate it. You know, black race, white, Asian race. We're all part of the human race. Now, there's various ethnicities, and that people aren't saying the proper term. This is part of the reason why I want you, because you have a master's degree in education and so many different certifications and experiences, what you believe should be talked about in these conversations, specifically about the eugenics and epigenetics. Because when I look at that article and when I see and watch these videos, and those two videos were very powerful. First of all, let's start with the art about the breastfeeding, because you're a breastfeeder. What did you think about that?
Yeah, it was interesting. And I also feel like it's so close to my heart because I had a dear friend go through a similar custody issue when she was breastfeeding her daughter. And in this situation, you know, she ended up stopping breastfeeding altogether. And there was no breastfeeding going on. And I'm a huge advocate for breastfeeding for so many different reasons. And at that same time, for that article, like to me, it's like if the father of your children, like if you want them to be involved and you want that process to be amicable, it would make sense to bottle feed, right? Like my son is 3.5 and we're still on our breastfeeding journey. And in the beginning, you know, my husband really wanted to be involved. That's part of his connection with my child, is to be able to feed his child. And so pumping and giving him access to be able to bottle feed our son, to me, was beautiful. And I wanted that experience for them. In that respect, it isn't that difficult to do. However, of course, if this mother in the article is feeling resentful for this man, then of course she would do things like that, like to manipulate the situation. But in reality, in the grand scheme of things, like pumping and to create more abundance of your breast milk, to then be able to give it to your partner to feed your child, I think is a beautiful thing. And of course, again, the word force was my concern in that video or in that article, right? Because is it that they're forcing her to actually bottle feed, or is it that they're forcing her to give milk for her child? And I think there's a difference between that, because of course, if she's with her child, they could just latch and she could nurse the traditional way. Yeah. I think the article is really kind of misworded, unless I'm just completely not understanding the case here. But it wouldn't be that they were forcing her to stop latch nursing. It would be that they were forcing her to give the dad milk in order for him to also, you know, continue that journey. And so for me, like, that is almost a better situation than what happened with my friend, right? My friend was like basically not given the opportunity to breastfeed anymore because of the custody and then just the lack of being with her child, and her breast milk dried up. And so there's things that we can do, even like pumping, right? If you continue pumping, your breast milk will never dry up. Adding certain things to your diet, of course. But yeah, the article was just really interesting to me because I just feel like at any point, if you're able to give your child your own breast milk over formula, then that's going to be better. So like, for me, my question to her would be, wouldn't you rather send your baby with their father with your breast milk versus having him go to the store and buying formula, which is not the best for your child? And so that's interesting. I would love to see like what happens next with that article, because I'm curious, like what happens in that situation, and what was the thought process of that mother in the situation.
You watch the videos. Let's start with the first video, because that talked about, and I'm just reading from the YouTube channel. It says the history, and the video is entitled "The Untold Abuse of Black Male Slaves by White." Again, this is on the YouTube channel Black Journals. And so I'm just reading the description of the video because it's a two-part. And I'm just paraphrasing some of the stuff. It talks about the history of slavery as a painful reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and oppression. It talks about slavery in America was deeply entrenched in the colonial or from the colonial era through the antebellum period, with enslaved Africans and their descendants subjected to forced labor, physical punishment, and various forms of degradation. It talks about what the term antebellum means, which is a Latin term where ante means before and bellum means war. It focuses on the period before the Civil War, specifically between the years of the late 18th century, which was after the war, 1812, all the way down to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. It really starts to get into how white women played a huge and leading role in slavery, especially of Black males. Because we do have these conversations on the Trigger One Talk podcast that can be triggering, we use real words. So there was a lot of raping going on in slavery. Most people only think of it being the white male slave owners to the Black women and girls that were slaves. There was a lot of raping going on for those Black men by those white women who were slave owners. Some of them owned slaves through the marriage. Some of them owned slaves outright, and they weren't married. And so that YouTube video talks about it, and they really do a great historical breakdown of that in parts 1 and 2. I want to get your thoughts about, let's start with the part 1. When you saw that video, and I know you got a bunch of notes, so again, the mic is yours.
Okay. Yes. Oof. Oh, okay. So one of the things that I think really tackles the epigenetics portion of what we're talking about is it's really interesting that in those times, in the antebellum period, white little girls would be gifted slaves. And so that got me thinking about like the conditioning, right? So a lot of times when we're talking about epigenetics and in the ancestral generational space, there are things that are passed down from generation to generation. And that is actually on a genetic level. Like that is actually shown within our DNA that things like, addiction and mental health can be passed down. Traumas that happened hundreds of years ago can be passed down. And so when I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about this programming that now is on the other side, right? Because a lot of the things that we've been talking about thus far is from the Black perspective, but everybody has ancestors, so everybody has ancestral trauma. And so, and the conditioning and the programming goes right into that. And so the fact that these infants, these little girls of the daughters of the slave owners would be gifted slaves, and that they would be taught how to manage slaves. They'd be taught with their brothers how to create compliance within slaves, right? The whipping, the beating, the raping. And it was just interesting to me from that part 1 about how deep that programming is. And then it gets me to think about like the women in the last just 50 years and the things that some white women have created within our country that are like really, really horrible. And, it's really quite interesting because, again, just linking back to the antebellum period and how they were conditioned and programmed to perceive Black men as lesser than, and of course, Black people altogether. But that part 1, like a lot of the notes that came from that was just the conditioning, right? And that we are not human, that the Black men were not human, that they were animals, that they could be controlled and that they could be manipulated and nothing would happen, right? Like that they wouldn't get in trouble per se. And of course, there were sometimes, like in that part 1, where there was a woman who housed a lot of slaves and her husband was frequently gone. And she had the secret chamber and the top level floor.
Oh, the lady in Louisiana. God. Whew. That
Yeah.
one right there, y'all got to look at this. I'm telling you. I don't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. There's this woman in Louisiana, in NOLA, New Orleans, who owned slaves, and she had this mansion. It was a 3-story mansion, and she was into what we now know as the sadomasochism type of stuff, the BDSM. But she was doing it to her slaves. It wasn't like she was doing this to other white men, whatever.
And then taking it to a whole nother level.
Looking at you talking about like torture to the 20th power.
And so, like, and it was interesting when I heard that there were actually laws on the upkeep of slaves, right? Like, you had to take care of them to a certain degree because then they could be traded, bought, da 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 da. And so the fact that she actually ended up getting kind of caught during the fire, right? And people were able to discover her torture chamber, and that she was actually, I don't know if she was just fined. I think it was just fined. Like, I think that's the only thing that happened to her, is that she was just fined. Like a slap on the wrist, like, it was just so incredible to me that these secrets within our history, like, I can't believe it took me until now to even know that. Like, that's wild to me. And, it just shows again, like, the programming. Like, was she gifted slaves when she was a baby? Did she see the torture of the whipping and all of that happen when she was a child, before, like, her parents died, and all these different things? And so it's, again, like, with this ancestral trauma and the epigenetics of this, like, it does get passed down. And that's why I think, like, I was going to bring this up, and now I have to. In the comment section on one of the videos, I love reading, like, the trolls. I love reading the comment section. But one of the comments was, "This explains all of the Karens of today." And I just was cracking up, because it's kind of true, right? Like, there are some times where the white women who overstep their boundary, right? Or they don't stay in their lane, and they're getting into somebody's business that's not theirs. And can you link that to ancestral trauma with their grandmothers, their great grandmothers were doing? Like, certainly, right? And so it's not to give them an excuse or a pass to like not be like that anymore, but it is just a reality that we can look at, and that once we start to realize all of these things are happening around us because of where we came from, we can start understanding our history and how to do better, right? And how to show up differently when we are encountered with a Karen, or like how to show up differently, or how to really compose yourself or hold yourself. And so that was one of the notes I had. And another thing that I think is really important for people to understand is that it wasn't just the white slave owners to the black women, and it wasn't just these white women raping the black men. Sometimes, and actually it happened quite often, where the owners, whether it was the male or the female white person, doesn't matter who it was, would actually force the slaves themselves to have sex. So it would be the owner of this woman who she knew that she was pregnant and that she wanted a wet nurse. So a wet nurse is what in that day was a black woman who could produce milk for that white child. So a lot of the times in part two that they were talking about was like this collective rape subjectivity. And what that really means is that it was happening on all fronts, on all angles, and all layers. And for me, that is one of the, like, part two was a really personal experience for me because of the sexual trauma that I have endured that has been a pattern in my bloodline, in my lineage. And I only know my maternal side for that type of history. However, it's so prevalent on my maternal side that it's like, not only, was it the white men raping the black slaves, like the black men were forced to rape black women. And again, like, that is the cycle that was in my family. Like, my grandmother was born because of her mother being raped by a black man. So a black man raping a black woman, producing my grandmother. And yeah, it's just like all of these things that when you zoom out, you can like, whoa, holy fuck, what is happening? Because it's only up to us, the people who are currently alive, to break those cycles. And there's a lot of people doing that work right now, cycle breakers and generational curse, like scholars, all these different things that are happening. And for me, that was like what really hit home when they said that word, collective rape subjectivity. Because in my reality, I've had relationships and relations with all different types of ethnicities. However, all of my experiences of sexual harassment and rape have been from Black men. And so I was just thinking about that as I was listening to that part too, and like, wow, like they were actually forced to create harm with families, and then that has a ripple effect to today, to now, to when my grandmother was born, like all of these things. And so those were like my big juice notes from those two parts. And yeah, it really touched me because that's my personal experience.
You know what came to mind when you were talking? I was thinking about the movie The Color Purple. We know that's a work of fiction, great book, and better movie. And I know they're redoing the movie, which that's a whole nother conversation. Anyway, I think about the scene where Sophia, who was played by Oprah Winfrey, she was working for she was Miss Millie's maid, and she had just got out of prison. She's working as the maid, which that whole argument that ended up landing her in prison when she ended up hitting the white guy was all about her working as this woman's maid. And she was like, no, I don't want to be your maid or whatever. So she ends up getting incarcerated for 12 years, gets out of prison, ends up working for the lady any damn way. And I remember the scene, and if you haven't seen the movie by now, some just whatever. So spoiler alert, whatever. There's a scene where she gets like a chance to go home and spend the holidays. It was Christmas, I believe, with her family that she hadn't seen since she's been pretty much in jail, or since she even got out of jail. So they go home, she drops her off, and she couldn't drive really well, the woman, Miss Miller. And so it got to the point where all the men, the Black men that were there at the house that was trying to help her, she got scared, like they were trying to attack her or whatever. And so Sophia comes out of the house and she kind of makes this statement, talking like they were trying to hurt her or harm her or something like that. And, she kind of looked at her like, no, that's not what they're trying to do. But, and then the lady asked her to drive her home. And she's like, I'm here with my family. Like, you gave me this furlough or whatever you want to call it. And then she pulled the Karen move. She pulled the power move. Now, she wasn't her slave, but she was like an indentured servant at that point. And so she had to cut her vacation and her trip to her family short because, Miss Millie pulled a power move on her. And I thought, damn, it's nothing different than what a lot of, and I'm just, I normally don't speak for Black people, because the Black community doesn't meet in my house every Wednesday night for tea and crumpets, cigars and brandy for the guys or the women, so I'll just speak for me. In my experience, the guys that I've talked to, the Black guys that I've talked to when it came to dating white girls and white women, it was really kind of frowned upon because a lot of times we would hear stories where they may get together, the white women and the Black men, and then somehow the story gets out that this white woman or this white girl is with this Black boy or this Black man, and the word rape comes out. Or, if it doesn't come out, you think about Emmett Till's situation where he whistled, quote unquote, at this white woman in the South because he was from Chicago, and they killed him, So, when it comes to relationships, there's still a lot of Black men, even to this day, that will not even look at a white woman, let alone touch her, let alone have intercourse with her because of that fear of harm. And there's still, I was talking to Mrs. LP recently, and she said, she's in her mid-40s. She said when she was a late teen, because she's biracial, and she was adopted into a white family, and she said one of her brothers, who's white, his white friends made a statement to her and told her, basically, if I ever see or hear about you, letting a Black man touch you, it's going down. It's going to be a problem. You know, so we see and hear these things even in modern times, which is mind boggling because it's like, again, we're all humans. What did you think about the second video?
Yeah, that one was, again, just as I kind of touched on it a little bit, but that one in particular was really interesting to me, coming from the space of the breastfeeding, right? That part, and then also when the white women, well, it was talking about how the white women would oftentimes be lonely or have like pent up sexual energy, and so it was like interesting the language that they used in that video also. And I was like, like I wonder who the creator was of this video, because like, yeah, it's almost like, oh yeah, they had so much sexual energy that they just had to rape the black men, and it's like, I'm pretty sure if their husbands left the community, they weren't the only white man that left. You know, like there were other white men, but that could have been consensual. And so I think even that, right, like the language that we're using around these atrocities is also generational and ancestral. And like, why not just call the black horse black? Like just call it like it is. And it's interesting because in that video, I didn't notice it so much in part one, but definitely in part two, just the way that they were speaking about certain topics, I was like, I feel like not really sugarcoating, but it was like it wasn't articulated in the way that I might have said those same things. And so again, just with like this, even though I feel like the people who are putting this out there, like they do want the truth per se to be out there. It's just like in the manner of which it's what's happening. And so that was like the main thing that I was noticing within that video. And then also the statistic that I wrote down here, that white women actually comprised of 40% of the slave owners. So out of all the slave owners that were during the antebellum period, 40% of them were actually women. And they highlighted this, right? I know. I didn't know that until
I forgot about that. Yeah, I forgot about that particular stat. 40%.
Yeah, and there was even an example of two engaged people, a white woman and a white man, and they both had slaves. The man had, I think it was 8 slaves, and the woman had something like, oh, the crazy number. I can't even remember. It might have been like 30 or 60 slaves. Like it was a high number.
That was the Washingtons, George and Martha.
Yes, it was the Washington.
The president of the U.S., yes. He had 8 and she had like 56 or something like that.
Yeah, it was wild. And so again, like that number, that 40% of slave owners being white women, like how come this is not talked about? Like that's so wild. That's a huge number. Like in science, 40% is a lot.
I'll take 40% of anything that's valuable.
Right? It is, because again, like even just with that example with the Washingtons, right? So she then had a fight in court to keep her slaves as her own and not like handing it over to her husband. And yeah, it was just super interesting because I didn't know how white women in that time actually had the ability to buy, sell, and trade slaves on their own. Like I didn't know that they didn't need a husband to do that. And that comes from, again, what we were talking about before, but being gifted these slaves when they were infants, and then they grew into understanding how to be masters and how to be to have power over another human. And so they didn't want to relinquish that power once they got married. And I think that was also an interesting component to this entire picture that we've been painting for everybody today, is that it's always about power. Like all of this is about power, whether it's the whipping or the raping, like all of it is power. And the fact that actually the daughters and sons of the slave owners were forced to punish the slaves so that they can get almost like desensitize them to that process. And that was just mind-blowing too, because the desensitization to these things are obvious in our modern society. There was actually, I went to a luncheon several months ago, and it was all Black women. And I learned something, and it was this term called white virality. Have you heard of this? So, like, the word feral, like a feral, like wild savage, right? So the term white virality is really this notion that white people have it in their DNA, like in their genetics, in their being, to be savage, to be ruthless, to be violent, like all of these different terms. And so when I learned that, I was like, wow, that's really interesting because I can see that. Like I can see that maybe not to the extent that this one article was speaking about that I read, but it is interesting because I do believe that melanated people have more of earth-based practices in their ancestry. And so they're more connected to animals and to plants, and so that they're conscious of life, right? Like what is alive. And so that our actions and our habits are typically less violent because we are so connected and so aware. And then I think about, okay, what about all of the white ancestors of like the Nordic region, right, who were really connected with the land also, and like the witches that were all wiped out up in Northern Europe, like they were very connected to the land also. So then I was like, okay, so then when did this white ferality come into play? Like when did this actually become something that is worth speaking about in terms of ancestral and generational trauma? And so for me, I started thinking about just the beginning of the slave era, right? Because America, which a lot of people don't know, that America was kind of like the last country on board to slavery. And actually, after a lot of Europe had ended slavery, we were still doing it.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking about this white reality, and it's like, okay, so obviously it comes from Europe. And then like what part of that, like what initiated that? And I don't have the answer. I haven't really dug into that. But it is a concept that is really interesting, right? Like it triggers all of these questions into a lot of the atrocities that have happened in our country, that are either done by white people or were taught to us by white people. And so then again, like with the raping, right? Like and this is all hypothetical thinking, right? But like had the black man not been raped, or had the black man not been forced to rape others, like would that be part of their, because it happens so often now in modern times, like it happens so often, it's like, would that not be part of the conversation right now had they not had that influence back in the antebellum period? And so just all of these questions that can come up, but white ferality was a new concept for me, and I just learned about that a few months ago.
One of my favorite movies is Jungle Fever, Spike Lee's Jungle Fever. And there's a scene in the movie, and I'll just say spoiler, but if you haven't seen Jungle Fever, like, something's wrong. There's a scene in the movie where they're having dinner, so it's Wesley Snipes' character. He's sitting there with his parents, and he got into an interracial affair with this white Italian woman that he worked with. And so he was married with a child at the time. So when she found out about it, she threw him out and all this stuff. And so they got an apartment together and all this stuff. So this is a meet the parents dinner, his parents. Because her mom died. Her dad beat her with a belt when he found out. I mean, like whipped her with a belt, like she was a little kid, and put her out. And so they're having this dinner with his parents, and his dad is a minister. And he went into this kind of soliloquy about what's going on with them, and he tied it into what we're talking about now, how white women during slave times, they were exalted and they were put on this pedestal, and white men was like, you are the fairest thing in the world, kind of like a Cinderella thing or whatever. You're so exalted and wanted, like nobody should touch you, not even me. But in the nighttime, when the sun went down and they got to drinking or doing whatever, they sneak into the slave quarters and get all the black women, and sometimes they would even do rapes with black men, because there's some historical documentation about that also, where the white men were raping black men too. And he talked about that, and this was a really short scene. It only lasted a few minutes, but I thought about that also because when we're talking about epigenetics and we're talking about eugenics, especially from an ancestral and generational trauma perspective, as you know, there's so many elements that you can tie together, not just with the white virility, talk about chattel slavery, you talk about the economic portion of it, because even today there are conversations. I live in Charlotte. You're in Georgia. I'm in North Carolina. You're in Georgia. I can go less than 10 miles from where I live and see Confederate flags. Stone Mountain, Georgia passed a law that, because there's all these laws around the country where they're getting rid of these Confederate statues and flags and all this stuff or whatever. Georgia said, we're not going to touch Stone Mountain. It's going to stay just like it is, with those 3 Confederate generals ingrained in that granite mountainside of Stone Mountain. And Stone Mountain's going to still be Stone Mountain, because you can go there and at night they have this video thing that they show on the side of the mountain where those statues are engraved in that granite. And it's all about the Confederacy and all of this stuff. And it's kind of the video is not bad in terms of, like, they're not showing people like burning crosses or hanging folks and none of that stuff or whatever, but it's a celebration of the Confederacy and life. And it's very cleanly produced and different things like that. And I remember when I went to Stone Mountain with my family back in 2006, and we saw that video, and I was sitting there and I was like, I think we should go now. Because you start hearing a lot of the white folks, they was yeehawing and all this stuff, and I'm like, and I didn't know that they did this video thing, and I know they talked about having this fireworks display and all this stuff or whatever. And I was sitting there watching the video, and I was like, and it was some black people there, but it wasn't a lot of us. I mean, we were really in the minority in terms of the numbers. And I just remember, like, okay, it's time to go. And we got out of there. Nobody ever said anything negative to us, or we didn't get any flack or anything like that. I didn't recall anybody looking at us sideways and none of that stuff. I mean, everybody was, being respectful and all that. I just felt like, damn, I felt like I was in a time warp for that 30-minute period watching that video. For you being someone who deals with epigenetics, and I want to kind of just wrap it up because we're going to continue having these conversations. Overall, what are your thoughts about these particular topics? Because this conversation is as stifled as it may be, as whitewashed as it may get, as restrictive as it might get, especially in academia, but also in households, because that's where the real education starts. You learn more at home than you do in an academic institution, especially about social norms and society and different things like that. What say you from an academic perspective?
Yeah, this is a great question because I think it applies to everybody. Again, we all have ancestors. We all have come from a line of people, right? And so really what I would leave this conversation today is to one, start your reflection process, like reflecting on your belief system, because our belief system actually governs so much of our physical health and, of course, our mental and emotional health. But when we can start to evaluate that, everything changes. And what oftentimes happens is when we start this journey of introspection, looking at where our belief systems come from, we will realize that our beliefs usually don't come from ourselves, that they come from our parents, right? And that makes sense. Like when you start to think about it, it makes sense. And so if you are a person who might have some type of judgments towards certain people, and that doesn't mean it's only white people having judgments to black people, that could be black people having judgments to white people and all the other ethnicities in between. Because I remember having a Chinese friend when I was in high school, and her father was like really upset that we were friends until he met me, and then he was able to release all of his misconceptions of what Black Americans were, coming from China, and like only thing that he knew was what was being put out on the media. And so again, like with this evaluation of our belief systems, that can change so much for us on that genetic level, because our thoughts control so much of who we are and what we do. And again, like it's just this kind of this dance between our thoughts and our feelings, and that these are magnetic and and so influential. And so if you feel like, you know, there's something that could be done differently, or you can show up differently in your life to the people who you're working with, who you surround yourself with, to start with your belief system, because then everything else will be able to be modified with ease. And so, yeah, with the epigenetics portion of what we're talking about today, this can really start with the exploration of self. And I think that's where it always should start. Any type of healing, anything that's going on, you start with yourself. You look inward and you see what you can do differently, because it's not, you know, I don't play the blame game. You can't blame your parents. Oh, well, my parents were racist, so I all these years I've been racist. It's like, okay, you know, we have to take radical self-responsibility over our lives. And so that is a huge piece of what I do, and the work that I do is self-accountability. And that plays into so much of what we're doing and how we're crafting our reality, right? Because the two main things, like I said before, that craft our reality are our thoughts and our feelings. And so and so what we're doing and what we've been talking about here, there's a lot of feelings that can rise up, right? These are uncomfortable conversations. These are conversations that can be very triggering. And so your thoughts and your feelings that go with this can really determine the outcome on how you perceive the race tension in our country, or how you are perceived as who you are. So yeah, I think that would be like the golden ticket to start, is modifying your thoughts, because again, that's where it starts, your thoughts and your feelings.
I got on the screen a picture, and it's kind of a video. I don't know if you would call it a meme. And I told you, Simone, I need your brain more than just its work in terms of these episodes. You're my social media mentor. We'll talk about that. You got a great post on your IG page, and it started off with a picture of a black man with a chain wrapped around his hand, around his arm. And the caption reads, "The world is literally burning." So y'all got to watch this episode, so again, you miss stuff when you don't watch it. And we love our listeners, so keep listening. We just want you to watch also. The world is literally burning. We do not fear it, for we know from ashes we rise. Phoenix is born. We are coming together in unity, in love, in purpose. Become the master of your desired reality. Free your mind and your soul. A divine and brilliant mind is guiding us this Wednesday on a journey that unlocks the truths of exiting the matrix and having the capacity to be present with the things you love, and creating a high frequency online business and or amplifying the business you already have, understanding why freedom matters and why most people don't ever create it. And there's some other information on here that if you want to know more about what Simone has on her social media, I'll have the links in the show notes, as always, for her social media, including her link tree, which is phenomenal, because you offer so much stuff on your link tree. It is just like, wow, you know, it's like you're a one-stop shop, as I call it. So I want to
thank you for bringing up that poem. It was I wrote that poem really with this idea, right, of that even though we are not slaves, right, physical slaves working in the field and in the house, that a lot of us are still slaves in our mindsets, right? Like we're either a slave to the system, or we're slaves to whatever belief system that has been constructed for us, not by us, but for us. Like these thoughts and these beliefs are given to us, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. And that poem that I wrote was, I was in this state of like just really wanting to like shout from the rooftops, like the freedom doesn't really exist like you think it does. You know, if you're still succumbing to a lot of these different notions and beliefs, and like still blaming, right? Like that, talking about blaming other people for your situation, like you're then a slave to them, right? If you're blaming your ex from 10 years ago for your situation now, like you're a slave to that ex, or whatever you have it. So yeah, that was really important for me to get that message out there, that the chains are not literal anymore. They're not physically on us, but they can very well be in our minds.
Simone Akasha Nofel, conscious parenting expert, spiritual scientists, ancestral trauma healing. You got the Healy on. Let me see it.
Ooh, I got it.
Yeah, your Healy device. If you want to know more about the Healy device, go to her link tree, and I'll have that link again posted in the show notes. Applied Epigeneticist. You have a great alternative IG page, which is at Hardy and Free, which talks about all of those things, also especially with the Healy. And also you have another IG page, ways.of.the What is that particular?
That is our family adventures. So that started when we first got our camper van, and then we moved to Costa Rica. So we were expats for a while. So it's like documentation on our adventures as a family.
Cool. I want you to stay on because we're about to end. I want to show the story because today is September 11th, 2023. And, today is the 22nd anniversary of the events that happened in New York City with the collapse of the Twin Towers by these terrorists. I, being a retired paramedic, part of the reason I got into EMS was I got into EMS in 2006 because when I thought about what happened on 9/11, I remember exactly where I was when that happened. And I remember that there was two lines of people that were at ground zero. These were public service workers, police, fire, EMS, other public service workers that work for the city. And it was just a sea of humanity, like they talked about during the George Floyd trauma. And I remember wanting to be one of those people that was passing down buckets of rubble as they were clearing ground zero. I was in St. Louis at the time. Wasn't even thinking about EMS during that time. I was doing computer work, and I was working in social services during that time. And 5 years later, I ended up getting into EMS. And so today being the anniversary of 9/11, I want to highlight, because we talk about missing persons and we talk about true crime. Well, I got 2 for 1 today. So this comes from a website called Independent, and their URL is independent.co.uk. So this is a media company in the UK in England. And they got a story about 2 9/11 victims are finally identified through DNA testing days before the 22nd anniversary of the terror attack. And they said efforts by the OCME, and that's the city medical examiner in New York. Their efforts have meant more victims' remains can return to families because a lot of DNA is being collected from like Ancestry and 23andMe and other sources or what have you. There's a picture in this story, and it says the remains of over 1,000 victims, because there were over 3,000 that died on 9/11. The remains of over 1,000 victims are being held at the World Trade Center Memorial waiting to be tested. And it says 2 victims of the September 11 attacks have been identified by advanced DNA testing days before today's anniversary. Today marks the 22nd year since the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center that destroyed the Twin Towers and killed 2,977 victims. Both the man and the woman have been ID'd. Their names are being withheld at the family's request. New York City's medical examiner has been testing the remains of the attack victims, which are all stored in the National September 11 Memorial and Museum at the World Trade Center site. The process is being carried out in order to return the victims to their families. A positive ID match has not been made in 2 years, since September 2021 until a few days ago. Before this, the last match was made in 2019. That just floors me. And this is not any to cast any dispersions against the OCME or the officials in New York, because I know that they are working their butts off to bring closure to these families. It just boggles my mind that 2,977 people people are dead. There's over 1,000 of these victims that have not been identified. And you would think with the advances in technology, especially in DNA, and I got to do some more research on this because I just haven't in a while. But, I want to say that to all of those that have been affected by the tragedy of 9/11, because it changed the world as we know it. You talk about like December 7th, 41, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they call that a day that lived in infamy. This is the same, and in some ways even worse because it changed our whole world. So me being a paramedic and a firefighter in my office, you see behind me, I got two posters of one is a firefighter poster, one is a cardiology chart, because as a paramedic, you're a junior cardiologist. And you can't see it behind me, but behind my chair, I got a cork board with all these fire and police and EMS patches and all kind of stuff or whatever. I just want to say that to those that are still mourning the loss of those 343 firefighters and those paramedics and those EMTs and all of those workers that worked in both towers and those that were lost in the Pentagon attack, as well as those that were on United 93 that went down in Pennsylvania. Peace and blessings be upon you and your families, as well as those eternal souls of those that are not here anymore forever. Never forget 9/11. And on my desk here, I got a puzzle that I got from my mother-in-law. It is a 3D puzzle of One World Trade Center that I put together. And it was like 40 pieces or something like that. And this is like one of my prized possessions. It keeps me focused on the work that I do. Even though I'm retired, I'm still in that fox. I still work as a consultant for active violent critical incidents, teach CPR classes, stop bleed stuff, talking about these public health and public safety and gun safety. I'm getting to the 2A, the politics of that stuff. But as someone who's retired, I never forget what got me into doing the work in the first. That's it. That's all. Again, Simone, as always, I want to thank you so much. We'll come up with some more information and do part 6 because we're going to keep talking about ancestral and generational trauma as long as we can do it. For Simone A, this is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. In the closing, take a first aid CPR, stop the bleed class. Not a matter if, but when and where an emergency is going to happen. And what are you going to do if you get caught up in that situation? Because emergencies happen everywhere. Houses of worship, schools, businesses, academic institutions, hospitals, concert venues, sporting events, you name it, any time of day, anywhere. Anybody can get it and anybody can give it when it comes to trauma. We want you to be an immediate responder until a first responder can show up and take over patient care. Be a bydoer, not a bystander, as my man, my work partner, Doc, always says. LP out.